Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening. It's 6 o'clock over here, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Hallie Grand, and I am going to be facilitating our webinar here this evening. So before we get started, I just want to run through a few quick reminders about how this webinar is going to go this evening. Your cameras, microphones, and chat are all going to be disabled during the webinar. If you have any questions about the presentation today, please use the Q&A feature that's located on the bottom of your screen in Zoom. The button looks like two chat bubbles. We're going to be answering all questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to type your question in at whatever point during the presentation into that Q&A box, just so you don't forget what you want to say later. If you would like to provide public comment about the proposed mariculture site that we're discussing here this evening, you must send them via email. We are not taking public comments about the site through Zoom. Contact information, that email address will be shown on the screen later during the presentation, and you will also be receiving a follow-up email from Zoom tomorrow with that email address, along with a link to our YouTube channel where you're going to be able to find the recording of tonight's webinar. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Zach Olson to begin our presentation.
Hi, yeah, thanks y'all. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, Holly, can you see my screen, hear me?
Yep, everything's good.
Okay, well, thanks y'all for coming out for another Cultivated Oyster Mariculture public hearing. Tonight, we're here to talk about a proposed mariculture grow-out facility located in the larger Aransas Bay system. Specifically, this is located in Copano Bay, and we'll go into some details about where exactly that is here shortly. One second, there we go. Many of you have set in on several of these public hearings, and so this is kind of going to be review for you. This is going to look a lot like some past public hearings we've done. We're going to be following the same meeting format, order of events, but for those of you who haven't set in yet, we're going to start out just by providing some general information about oyster mariculture in Texas, since we know this is still a fairly new program. Many of you all maybe aren't aware of what cultivated oyster mariculture is and what those facilities tend to look at. So we're going to start with a quick review of that. Then we're going to go into some details specifically related to this site and where it's located, some of the proposed operations. We're going to talk about a natural resources survey for the area, and then we're going to finish up providing information on how you can submit public comment on this if you choose to do so. And all of that information for submitting public comment is going to be at the end of the presentation. So just some quick background on Cultivated Oyster Mariculture. This is, again, a fairly new program. We started accepting applications, TPWD started accepting applications in September of 2020. And those applications could be for grow-out facilities or grow-out farms, which is what we're here to talk about tonight, or for nurseries / hatcheries. All of the grow-out operations are off bottom. And what that means is that oysters are stocked into cages or floating bags and placed into permitted areas of public waters where the oysters are then worked and grow to a harvestable size. To reiterate, oyster seed is from hatcheries stocked into the cages or bags. These aren't coming from wild reefs or public reefs. These are all stocked oyster seed. And then, like I said, a big process of oyster mariculture is that these oysters are worked and cleaned in such a way that they produce a valuable product for market. So applications nominate their own sites, and then we work with them through that process, through a consultation process, and then they also conduct a natural resources survey to verify that there won't be any natural resource impacts associated with these sites. So just a little bit of some imagery with regards to what some of these sites can look like. There are several different gears that folks will use on these sites. If you've been involved in the mariculture program in Texas, especially in this area, you'll be very familiar with this floating cage style that you see to the left on your screen. This is what a majority of applicants are proposing to use in our area, and this is in fact the gear that's being proposed for use for the site tonight. little bit more about some of the background in terms of the permitting process. So TPWD is the lead agency on this, but there's several agencies the applicants are required to get authorizations from, because these other agencies have authority over various things that oyster mariculture may impact. But the TPWD permit has a 10-year term. There's an annual fee paid. It's based on the size, and the fees differ based on whether it's a grow out or a nursery hatchery. Like I said, there's many agencies involved in the permitting process that applicants must get authorizations from, including Texas General Land Office, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and U.S. Coast Guard. We do have an active use criteria for a final permit, for applicant of a final permit or the recipient of a final permit. That essentially boils down to a minimum number of seed that we require to be stocked on these sites. We only allow for mariculture of eastern oyster, and specifically oyster from Texas broodstock. We have some very, very strict genetic and biosecurity guidelines for stocking oysters into Texas public waters. But because these oysters are not coming off of wild reefs, they're not stocked from wild reefs, we do allow for year-round harvest off of these mariculture facilities. However, all operations must comply with Texas Department of State Health Services regulations as they relate to human health concerns. So kind of transitioning now to this specific grow out facility. The proposed site is technically called G-0007. That's just a running number that we keep in terms of the number of sites that have essentially gotten to this phase of the permitting process. So that's the formal permit number for this site. Like I said, this is an oyster grow out facility. So what that entails is that seed, or sometimes slightly larger oysters or slightly larger than seed, are stocked into these cages, and they're allowed to grow to marketable size and then sell to market. It's located in Copano Bay, and we'll talk specifics about that in a second. Copano Bay is Shellfish Harvest Area TX30. That's based on the state Department of State Health Services shellfish designations, and that is approved waters for shellfish harvest. And the total acreage of the site is 5 acres. So what you're looking at now are some maps related to the location of this facility. The map all the way on your left is a kind of a zoomed out map of Copano Bay and then Aransas Bay as well. And the star you see kind of on the eastern side of Copano Bay is the location of the farm. The image on the right now is zoomed in to this Copano Bay site, and the location of the site is in the Newcomb Bend area of Copano Bay. Zoom out just a little bit from that image on the right. Again, the site is right up here in the Newcomb Bend area of Copano Bay. This is the proposed access route that the applicant has proposed. They propose to access and, in fact, work the site from a boat and access it from the South Copano Causeway boat ramp. You can kind of see their proposed track across the bay to access that site. What you're looking at now is an overhead view of the site layout. So the square you're looking at here is the 4 corners of the proposed 5-acre site. The black dots are individual cages, and yellow dots are buoys. What we do is we require applicants to give us a maximum configuration of gear on their site. It can, when this site is operational, or if this site is operational, the number of cages can be less than the proposed, but we want to know the maximum configuration of cages on this site, or gear on this site. There's a total of 585 cages, and 585 cages and oriented in 3 different rows. Each of these rows have 15 separate rows of cages. We have 50-foot run lanes associated between each of these rows of cages, and each of these lines are separated by about 20 foot. Kind of a cross-sectional view of the line of an individual line of cages. So 13 cages per line. And the 2 things I want to point out here is that each of these lines of cages is anchored on both sides by a helical anchor, and then each helical anchor is marked with a large buoy. We'll zoom into one of these cages here in a bit, and I'll show you exactly what the orientation of those cages looks like, whether it's feeding or whether it's desiccating or whether it's on bottom. So we'll zoom into there in a second. But just some of those details, we've already mentioned some of this about the proposed site, but the applicant has proposed to use these OysterGro high flow cage 6-bag system. This is pretty typical for a lot of the proposed sites in this area. Again, a max array of 585 cages on the 5-acre site. Each line of cages is anchored to the bay bottom at each side with a 66-inch helical anchor using 1/2-inch polypropylene line. There's essentially a backbone of line strung between those anchors, and those cages are attached to that line. Each line is marked with orange PVC buoys. And just some specifics, 13 cages per line, 3 in each row, and then, like I said, 15 essentially in each column. The corner markers of the proposed site, the 5-acre site, will be marked. We defer to U.S. Coast Guard requirements for that. That's actually one of the following steps the applicant will go through is to determine the appropriate markers. Those tend to be either large buoys or pilings. Also, the applicant has proposed bird deterrents. These are essentially just large zip ties on the cages, which create a tickler to keep birds off the cages. That's primarily for 2 reasons. One is we just want to avoid any sort of impacts to birds in these areas. And number 2, we also just want to avoid any sort of impacts from birds on the cages themselves, from defecating or anything like that. So that's the purpose of those bird deterrents, and they're required for use if that becomes a problem. So I want to zoom in a little bit to these OysterGro cages just to give you an idea of what they look like in case you're not familiar with them. Essentially, these are 2 large ballasts with a large cage on top, and then inside that cage there are smaller bags with various mesh sizes that the applicants will use to put oysters in. Those bags will typically vary by mesh size as the oyster grows. But the size of these cages is approximately 3 foot wide by approximately 60 inches long. And then the height of these of this gear from ballast to top of the cage is just under 2 foot, about 23 inches. So we also require that applicants tell us a little bit about their proposed operations on site as part of the operations plan. The applicant has proposed that they'll typically be accessing the site at least 2 to 3 times per week, but likely daily during high production or harvest times. Floating cages will be flipped or desiccated as part of the growing process. Any gear that requires cleaning will be done off-site on land and away from the permitted site area. Oysters may be tumbled and sorted as needed on site, and either on vessel or on land. I imagine it's very weather dependent. We also require a hurricane plan of all of our applicants. To note, the hurricane plan the applicant provided is very in-depth, but just kind of to give you the main take home here is that the plan states that cages will be sunk for Category 1 hurricanes or above, or if they're predicted hurricane force winds within the site or that are projected for the site. Post-storm recovery, of course, includes refloating cages, and we'll talk a little bit about what floating versus sinking cages looks like here in a second. But post-storm recovery includes refloating cages, inventorying, and reporting any missing gear. So 3 different orientations of these the OysterGro cage system. All the way to the left, you see what's called a feeding position. That's essentially where the ballast is on the top of the water and it holds the cage with the oysters in the water column for feeding out of the water column. That's the typical array of these cages when they're operational. In the middle, you see a flipped position in which the cages are being held out of the water by the ballast. That's really just done to help the oyster bags desiccate and helps with encrusting organisms, a major part of the growing process. All the way to the right, you see that submerged orientation that we discussed. And the main purpose of that is to allow those cages to sink to the bottom if there is severe extreme weather and avoid gear loss. That's really just done by opening the caps on those ballasts and allowing them to fill with water. As I mentioned, the applicant is required to conduct a natural resources survey. We as an agency do initially meet with the applicant and help them nail down their specific location based on habitat maps and information and data we have. After we've determined that the site seems to be far and away from user conflict and habitat impacts, we still require a natural resources survey from the applicant. The applicant tonight, as they've conducted a side scan sonar and bathymetry survey, and that's the image you see to the left. You see the proposed site in the center, and we require a natural resource survey not just for the site, but for 200 and 500 foot buffers around the site. We have some very specific regulations for seagrass and oyster habitat. In short, we require that there can be no seagrass within 200 foot of the proposed site and no oyster habitat within 500 foot of the proposed site. In addition to the side scan survey, we also require several core samples within the 200 foot buffer and also outside of the buffer when there's any sort of anomaly that's returned from the side scan sonar survey. And so we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. But just a quick summary of the survey. The depth range for this area is 4.4 feet to 5.2 feet, mean low or low water. And the typical sample composition is a muddy silt or sand. And I'll ruin the ending for you. There was no seagrass or oyster within the proposed site or within any of the required buffers. Zoom in a little bit more to that side scan image. You can see here again, the side scan image, the proposed site is the square in the center, 200 foot buffer in the blue, 500 foot buffer in the red. The yellow indicates areas where there are core samples. Core samples were collected, and then core samples collected in the 500 foot buffer specifically on any returns from the side scan image. None of these returns ended up being oysters or seagrass. So again, the results of this natural resources survey were that there was no seagrass or oyster habitat within the 200 or the 500 foot buffer respectively. And that concludes our presentation. Just a couple of things specific to providing comment. The deadline for providing public comment is November 30th, 2022. And as Holly said earlier, we will not be taking public comment via Zoom tonight. We're really just here to present this information, answer any questions you might have. But you can submit public comment to the oyster.mariculture@tpw.texas.gov page. Once we receive public comment, once we get through this public comment period, we will work with the applicant to address any public comments. Then if a conditional permit is issued after this, that conditional permit is good for 1 year. The conditional permit does not allow the applicant to begin mariculture activity immediately. The conditional permit is really used by the applicant to then go to other state and federal agencies and get the various authorizations that they need from those other agencies. Once they've secured all those authorizations, they come back to Parks and Wildlife. We make sure everything's in line, and at that time we issue the final permit, and mariculture activity can begin. So just kind of give you an idea of what that time frame is like. But again, just to reiterate, deadline for public comment is November 30th, 2022, and you can submit public comment at that email. I'll put that email on the screen here in a second. And as always, for more information about mariculture, please visit our website, and you can get to our mariculture page just by searching oyster mariculture on Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's website. A lot of good information on there about the program and about any other proposed sites. And with that said, I'm going to transition real quick to our question and answer. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to enter those in the question and answer box that's at the bottom of your screen, I believe, and we will answer those. So we'll just kind of open it up for a couple minutes here. One of my colleagues just pointed out that I incorrectly said that this site was located in TX30. To be clear, the harvest area that Copano Bay is located in is TX32. It said that on the screen, but I just wanted to make sure there wasn't any confusion there. So this proposed grow-out facility is located in TX32, Copano Bay. Okay, well, I see no questions. If you have any questions about this site after this presentation tonight, Feel free you can email questions to that oyster.mariculture@tpd.texas.gov email address. We'll get those answered. But please, if you want to provide public comment, you can do so at that email address through November 30th. Now I'll turn it back over to Holly now. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. And you pretty much covered everything I wanted to say. It's just about making sure that you all send your comments or any questions to that oyster.mariculture@tpwd.texas.gov email address. And again, you'll be getting an email reminder from Zoom with that and the link to our YouTube channel where you can find the recording of this webinar here this evening. And that's all that I have. So thank you guys again. Thank you to our panelists for coming out and presenting to us. And we will see you all next time. Thank you, everyone.